Hi everyone, and welcome back to Think Science, where today's topic is about the cell membrane and membrane transport. If it's your first time here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, as well as the bell icon so you can be notified on more science videos. And be sure to check out our previous videos, especially cell structure, to get a quick background on cell membranes first. Since we talk about lipids and proteins here, check out our videos on those topics too. So, let's get into it. First, we have our question of the day. What type of biological macromolecule is cholesterol? Leave your answers in the comments below. So cell membranes are very complex structures that deal with transport in and out of the cell. Membrane transport can be split into many different categories, and many different types of molecules are involved. First, we will talk about the different components of the phospholipid membrane. If you need a quick refresher about this, make sure to check out our previous video about cell structure. So, the phospholipids make up the bilayer membrane, but many different components are attached to these phospholipids that enhance the membrane's function of transport. Remember, the membrane has polar hydrophilic heads that face outwards, and nonpolar hydrophilic fatty acid tails that are on the inside part of the membrane. These fatty acid tails can be varied, so some may be saturated or unsaturated. A big component of the membrane after phospholipids is proteins. There are many different types of these membrane proteins. There are integral and peripheral proteins. Integral proteins are ones that are embedded into the phospholipid membrane. They thus interact with both an aqueous region outside of the membrane, as well as with the hydrophobic center of the membrane. Integral proteins are often used for transport of molecules across the membrane. Peripheral proteins, on the other hand, are attached to the outside of the membrane, and thus do not interact with the hydrophobic part of the membrane at all. Peripheral proteins are often involved in cell signaling pathways, such as inhibiting integral protein activity or acting as a binding site for receptors. Cell signaling pathways will be covered in depth in future videos. Another component of the membrane includes cholesterol. Cholesterol has a big and bulky ring structure between its polar head and nonpolar tail. It is usually connected to the phospholipids making up the membrane by hydrogen bonds. Cholesterol is important because it adds rigidity to the membrane and maintains the membrane's fluidity at varying temperatures and conditions. For example, when the membrane is in a low temperature environment, the hydrogen bonds holding cholesterol to phospholipids loosen, making the membrane more fluid. Finally, carbohydrates are also present in phospholipid bilayer membranes. They often attach to lipids or proteins on the extracellular side of the membrane. They aid in the protection of the cell as a physical barrier and often are involved in cell signaling. I mentioned earlier about the concept of a membrane's fluidity. Because the membrane is made up of so many different components, it is not a rigid structure, and its structure can change to make it optimal for the environmental conditions it's in. Factors that influence membrane fluidity include temperature and the composition of the membrane. For example, if lipids have shorter tails, it makes the membrane more stiff. If lipids are more unsaturated, there are more kinks in the membrane, making it more fluid. So now that we have talked about the composition of the membrane, we can talk about the main function of the cell membrane, and that is transport. The membrane regulates what comes in and out of the cell. Here, we break up transport into 4 types, where 3 are passive transport and 1 is active transport. Passive transport means no energy, or ATP, is used in transporting molecules. How does this happen? This happens when the molecules are going towards the concentration gradient. This means that these molecules are moving from a place where there's a high concentration of them to a place where there's low concentration of them. With active transport, however, molecules are going against the concentration gradient and going to a place where there's more of these molecules. In order to do this, the cell requires ATP. So the first type of passive transport is simple diffusion that does not make use of any proteins. Here, small and nonpolar molecules pass through the membrane. Because they're so small, they can easily slide by, and because they're nonpolar, the extracellular fluid pushes it inside of the cell membrane. The second type of passive transport is simple diffusion that uses a channel protein to pass through. A channel protein is a type of integral protein that has an opening for molecules to pass through. This is great for larger and polar molecules that can't fit inside of the membrane, like water. In fact, channel proteins that are used specifically for water are called aquaporins. The third type of passive transport is facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is when molecules use a protein to travel inside the cell, but these proteins are gated. This means they must open and close to diffuse molecules across the membrane. Now, the act of transport is not diffusion because molecules are going against their concentration gradient. Molecules often use the same gated proteins described in facilitated diffusion, but in order to pass through, the gated protein uses ATP produced by the cell. The energy in ATP is stored in the bonds between its 3 phosphate groups. The gated protein will break one of the bonds and use that energy, thus leaving behind a detached phosphate group and ADP, which now is only 2 phosphate groups attached. Make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more science videos. If you liked this video, make sure to hit that like button and comment any questions you have so we can answer them. Stay tuned for our upcoming videos about processes like photosynthesis and cellular respiration, as well as cell signaling. Thank you for watching. Thanks, Science!